Where it started. Where it started. No, it didn't start. No, no. The whole thing was that Chicago was different from New York. Okay, so like back in the days, and I'm talking in the '80s, right? So I'm talking in the early '80s when this is on the before the pretext of say Beach Street and Wild Style around in and around that time. I'm talking about those movies that had come out of New York, which were really starting to spread hip hop and the five elements, spreading the five elements, DJing and breakdancing and rapping and graffiti and mixing and the whole idea is that what I'm saying is that at that point it was nowhere near the phenomenon that you see today because no one actually knew if hip hop was going to keep on going or if it was going to fail. So they were not hip hop stations or rap stations. When I'm talking about the radio, not that was really outside of New York. So New York was kind of like the center for the growing phenomenon of hip hop. But basically speaking, in Chicago there was like HBK or something, and that's pretty much it. We would have some local TV and cable stations that would feature breakdancers like the Palomo Show and all these little access cable stations back then because there it wasn't streaming TV or anything like you see now. So all these old school crews from Chicago. This is what I'm talking about. Like Mosa and Bassif, the Union, the Feds, of course, ABC, CGA, FCA, GTC, ACW, UAC, that kind of thing, And, I remember, meeting, like Puma Crew out north and all this stuff, because BTB was a very old crew in the South Side, which is basically, the manifestation of Mob Inc. and Tag Inc., which was before BTB. So we were actually MOB and TAG, Mob and Tag, before there was BTB. So BTB popped up in 1984, but of course there were 2 more years before BTB where we were already together, but doing graffiti pieces on the outskirts of Farragut High School and little village and 18th Street and Pilsen and such things, where we were writing Mob and Tag Inc. At that point, that was I don't think even the Feds were around at that time because this is really, really, really old. So I'm saying that, like, I think that ABC crew, which later with Mars, kind of exemplified what the Feds were, from the North Side. I'm talking about like, Slang and Trickster, and, Puerto Rican scene and, Take Two and, those fundamental guys, Flash, B-Boy B, Flash, Take Two, all that, who formed up the kind of the nexus of the Feds and ABC, were really the forerunners of graffiti on the North Side. I think there's a Puerto Rican connection there. I mean, I could be wrong, but I think I would be safe in saying that the kind of stigmatic relation between, like, maybe say Stain and Peely and in other words, other people who lived in Humboldt Park on the North Side that were coming to Chicago, back and forth coming to Chicago, were in essence bringing back and forth various forms of those hip hop elements, whether it was graffitiing and rapping and so forth, or DJing and all that. And you can kind of see that when you look back and forth because these guys were also DJs as well. Which brings me back to the point that it's not like you see now, where there's crews that are just basically graffiti crews. There was no such thing at that time. There were graffiti crews in New York at that time that were strictly graffiti. But even in New York, they were basically fundamentally, unstigmatized, and meaning that they had been people who practiced many elements at once. So, in that sense, we were like New York in a way. I mean, old school Chicago was like New York in the sense that we were all, in other words, we were still breakdancing while we were graffitiing. So, we were crews, but we exemplified some of the other elements. We weren't just graffiti. We were breakdancers and rappers and all that. And that was really something that was, here goes that word again, it was stigmatic from New York, but it was passed down to Chicago, probably from Puerto Rican people and Latino peoples and minorities who were going from New York to Chicago. And I believe this is why the graffiti element was so heavily induced on the north side of Chicago, because Puerto Ricans from the north side lived on the north side, number one, Humboldt Park, Logan Square, and blah, blah, blah. They were out there and getting heavily influenced face to face. Not so much through TV or videos like most other people were, but actually from graffiti artists that were coming out of New York and settling down, at least temporarily, in Chicago and spreading their skills. So the early days in Chicago, the north side was more prevalent. However, there were certain pockets of the south side where we picked up graffiti very heavily. You can kind of see this when you visit the walls of sin. Because once in a while, when there was a wall of sin, not around anymore, but the walls of sin on the far south side, there's some very old stuff there. And you can kind of trace that from a branch of people who independently in other words, they were influenced from graffiti independently from the north side. So when you rack up people like GTC Crew and BTB and FCA, and you say, well, these guys are from Pilsen, like BTB, FCA, and GTC, basically Hispanic-dominated crews that evolved our graffiti skills independently from the north side. So to be quite honest with you, we were not influenced by graffiti artists from the north side. How do you know this? Well, you can go and see all the pieces from Northside writers and Northside crews, whether they be Puma Crew, Feds, and all that, and then you could go and see in contemporary. I mean, that means at the same time, simultaneously, we were doing graffiti. And you can kind of tell that we independently were influenced because we have very different styles of graffiti. The Northside had a more of a ratcheted, graffiti, more of a New York style, and mastered it too, topped it off. The South Side was more, because gang banging, the Latin Kings and the Disciples and the Black Gangsters and the Vice Lords and so forth and so forth, and Deuces and Kents and all, we had gangs around us that were not even, that are extinct. They are no longer around, is what I'm trying to say. So that's how far BTB, SCA, GTC were, because we were really, we were operating between those gangs, trying not to get hurt between these gangbangers, because we were not gangbangers. So, because we were not gangbangers, gangbangers, especially a lot of Hispanic-dominated gangs, they didn't understand what we wore, because there were no such thing as graffiti crews at the time. So they were like, well, who are these guys? So in the views of the Disciples or 2-6 or Latin Kings and, all these Hispanic gangs, which of course we respected their territory because they were there before us, obviously. However, they didn't understand what we wore. All they did was see us tag it in their hood. So we had to try to make peace with these, whatever gangs were residing in our neighborhoods, which is paramount, because if that didn't happen, they would have killed us. So wherever we operated in those gang territories, the gangs finally tolerated us when they understood that we were not gang banging or tag banging or any of that. They understood that we were graffiti artists or break dancers and so forth, and we dressed differently as well. So we had a different culture, and because of that, they let us be. So in hindsight, I believe that the evolution of graffiti in Chicago, in the old school terms, is very unique. I don't think that was the case with Los Angeles or even Detroit, which is basically our neighbors, so to speak. I think Chicago had a very strange evolution of graffiti. And when you go back in time, not now, you can't really tell now, but when you go back in time, you can actually see through the style of letters and from the styles of painting and characters that, we had different types of forms and styles and painting, a different type of can control at that time that was far different from each district in Chicago. And that is a big reflection of what we truly were.